Welcome to MAGAU. MAGAU exists to educate our fellow citizens about the core animating spirit of the MAGA movement. By animating core, we are talking about the beliefs, the values, the principles, the mood, the attitude that characterize the spirit of MAGA. And then we look at the extent to which the MAGA spirit lines up with Christianity, conservatism, and our American ideals. This is lesson 2 of our Foundation series. And in lesson 2, we look at the principle that 2 wrongs make a right. Most of us believe and teach our children that 2 wrongs do not make a right. But in MAGA world, that principle seems to be inverted, where 2 wrongs do indeed make a right. And we see this in the constant, what I call whataboutism that we see animating from MAGA world. So without fail, when I get into a discussion with MAGA supporting Christian friends, with whom I have many, because I am part of the conservative Christian world and have been my whole life. When Trump or other MAGA sorts of figures are criticized, without fail, the instinctive response is, what about them? What about Joe Biden? What about the Democrats? What about Kamala, etc.? In a recent discussion where I was drawing attention to Trump's declaration of lawlessness, that essentially no one breaks the law if they're trying to save the country, I had a friend on Facebook respond this way, and this is pretty typical. So we see here this constant finger pointing to deflect responsibility away from Donald Trump by pointing out how bad the Democrats are. And so this is called whataboutism, and behind whataboutism is implied that 2 wrongs make a right. That if the other side does something wrong, then that makes it okay for us to do the same thing. Now we see the origins of this whataboutism in MAGA the very beginning, during Trump's 2016 campaign against Hillary Clinton. Now, conservative Christians then, who were very aware, and I think much more honest than they are now, about Trump's many character flaws, which were most dramatically revealed in the infamous Access Hollywood tapes, started deflecting attention away from that to Hillary Clinton and her flaws as a candidate. And this was especially, the particular focus was, if you remember, on Hillary Clinton's email scandal, where she was using allegedly private email accounts for official government business. Now, this evasion of responsibility by pointing fingers at Hillary even continued into Trump's first presidency during the Russia investigation. Here are a couple of tweets from that period. Finally, let's look at a third example, this time after Trump's first presidency, with the classified documents ordeal. So Trump was indicted for obstruction of justice surrounding his retention of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. And shortly after Mar-a-Lago was raided, so to speak, or where the FBI came to retrieve the documents, it was revealed about classified documents being found at Joe Biden's home, later Mike Pence's home. And so even though we all know that it's not only illegal to possess classified documents in one's private residence, especially when you're no longer the president, and even though we would expect those documents, if it was a mistake, we would expect those documents to be returned immediately to lawful authorities, when it came out that Biden and Pence also had classified documents at their homes, the finger started being pointed and conservative Christian voters began overlooking and rationalizing Trump's possession of allegedly some of our most sensitive military secrets in his compound by pointing at, what about Joe Biden? What about Mike Pence? Now let's examine this two wrongs make a right principle that's implied by this constant what about them finger pointing by conservative Christian and American ideals. For conservatism, let's look again to Russell Kirk at his first of 10 conservative principles. Here's Russell Kirk. The conservative believes that there exists an enduring moral order. That order is made for man, and man is made for it. Human nature is a constant, and moral truths are permanent. So at the heart of conservatism is the belief of objective moral truths, objective right and wrong, that something is wrong because God made it so, because there is a moral order that we have an obligation to that is fitting with human nature. So we can't be relativists. We can't be situational ethicists where we say, well, it's okay if I did it, if someone else did the same thing, did something worse, or did something better. And we know this, and you don't have to be a conservative to recognize this. Instinctively, children, when confronted with wrongdoing, will point their finger at someone else, at another sibling, a friend at the playground, and say, what about them? She was doing it too. No responsible parent is going to excuse the child and say, well, hey, it's okay. They did it, and it's okay for you to do it. If you can point someone else who's doing it, that excuses your behavior. So we know that two wrongs do not make a right. We teach our children that, but in the MAGA moral value system, the opposite is true. Now, since this idea that two wrongs make a right just flies in the face of common sense and undermines this core conservative idea of an objective moral order that we're accountable to, we can definitely say that this whataboutism is unconservative. Next, let's turn to the teachings of Jesus to see how this principle squares with Christianity. I'm going to read from Luke chapter 6, verses 39 through 42. This is from Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to focus here on what Jesus has to say about hypocrisy. And he also told them a parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, Brother, let me take out that speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. In other words, what Jesus is saying to us here is that the way to become a hypocrite is to focus more on the shortcomings and the sins of others than you do yourself, to prioritize confronting and dealing with their issues than your own issues. Now, mainstream media bias against Republicans, against conservatives is real. It's been with us for decades. It is definitely the case that they will judge Republicans, conservatives by standards that they often fail to hold their own politicians. I want to acknowledge that that's true. However, if you believe that your opponents are wrong to do something and it makes you mad, but then you use that to excuse what the politicians on your side are doing, then you yourself are joining them in that hypocrisy. You yourself are becoming a hypocrite, which you're basically saying they're a hypocrite, so it's okay for me to be a hypocrite too. It's being a hypocrite about hypocrisy. Now, obviously, this is a recipe for moral decay because no one is held accountable. The Democrats don't want to be held accountable by the Republicans. Republicans do not want to be held accountable by Democrats. Accountability is best done from within, but we've completely let go of any kind of accountability within our own community because our focus is shifted on the sins and the evils of the other side and not the sins and the evils in our own political household. So this principle of this warning against hypocrisy and this principle that we should focus on our own sins more than we do the sins of others. This relates to a second biblical principle, which is that our moral judgments as Christians should be focused primarily on the church, on the wrongdoing and the wickedness of other Christians closest to us in our own community, and leave judgment of those outside the church, of non-Christians, to God. And we see this principle communicated clearly by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. And I will read from chapter 5, starting in verse 9. Paul writes, "I have written you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers, or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I am writing you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is sexually immoral, or greedy, an idolater, or a slanderer, a drunkard, or a swindler. With such a man, do not even eat. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked man from among you." Now, this instinct of whataboutism to point fingers at Democrats, to deflect responsibility away from Trump and other Republican politicians, to bemoan the wickedness and evil of the secular left, of the radical left, who are not even inside the church for the most part. This goes completely against the principle in Scripture where judgment should begin with the household of God, where the priorities should be foremost on dealing with evil in the church, so much so that we should not publicly associate with politicians who are unrepentant, who are publicly, who are notorious sinners and unrepentant of their sins. So finally, let's look at our founding fathers and their priority on the importance of virtue of the citizenry, both private virtue of private citizens, but also the public virtue of the nation's leaders. Now, virtue is about character. It's about personal integrity. It's about doing the right thing because it's right. It's about conforming one's soul to the moral law. It's the exact opposite of excusing bad behavior by pointing fingers at someone who is worse or someone who is doing the same thing. Let's have a look at what John Adams had to say about the importance of virtue. He stated it this way: "Public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private virtue, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics." Well, whataboutism works against virtue. It promotes hypocrisy. It encourages vice. It's a recipe of moral deterioration because it just goes back and forth. If we justify our wrongdoing by pointing their fingers at them, they justify their wrongdoing by pointing their fingers at us. Where does it end? Conservative Christians are supposed to be salt and light in their communities. We're supposed to be preserving goodness and virtue. We're not supposed to be promoting vice, which is exactly what we do when we excuse our politicians' sins and injustices by pointing fingers at Democrats. So in conclusion, MAGA claims to be championing Christian values in the public square, when in fact, it's doing the opposite. It's working against the conservative belief that virtue matters, that moral law is objective, and wrongdoing is not justified just because someone else is doing it. And it goes squarely against the teachings of Jesus, warning us against hypocrisy that comes about when we're more concerned about the sins of others than the sins of those outside of our community than our own. And against the Apostle Paul's instructions that we leave judgment of the world up to God, and that we focus our own judgment towards other Christians, towards wickedness inside the church, and really focus on trying to get rid of that in society foremost, and leaving the rest up to God. If you enjoy this content and would like to be supportive, please follow our page or like our page. Please share these videos with others and help us to enlarge the imprint of MAGAU.